Hello, Christine, and welcome.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your experience, and just a little bit about you to get started?
Okay. So I have been working in the field for about 30 years. But even despite all that amount of time, I think myself, like many of my colleagues, other speech language pathologists, my comfort level with stuttering is hit or miss. Um, I try and attend as many trainings as I can, but anytime I come across a student who doesn't fit what I think I should see, I get, I'm never sure what I should do next. So that's kind of where I'm standing with this type of case. Um, so that's why I'm reaching out to you guys to offer some guidance.
Okay, thank you. And Christine, that happens so often for those of you who work in the schools and are so eclectic and see so many different children with so many different combinations of needs, and you may or may not see a child with speech fluency issues, whether stuttering or maybe cluttering or something else, or in combination with something else that might change it up a little bit. So, for someone like me who does stuttering 100% all the time, it's a very different view. But then when other things come up for me that aren't stuttering, then I'm sort of in that same quandary of reaching out for information and ways to help those clients who look a little bit different than what I might expect. So, do you want to fill us in on the particular client and what you're noticing and what your questions might be?
Yeah, so the client is a middle school student, and they came to me with the diagnosis of stuttering. And as I've been working with the student, I'm seeing not so much traditional stuttering or what I think is traditional stuttering, but more of unexpected um, breathing that's impacting how he's saying words. He's putting in breaks where breaks shouldn't be and inserting additional sounds um, that are very disruptive to the flow of speech, but not that classic repetition, block, or prolongation sound. So an example might be he would add, so if he was going to say the word inside, he would say inside hide. He would add an H and then the rest of the word. Or be he for the word be. Snacks, hacks is those are some of the classic examples of the pattern that he's following.
Okay, thank you. And I was about to ask you if you could model that for me, so I really appreciate your doing that. So let's back up a little bit. So
Okay.
before he came to you, what were you told? What kind of paperwork, what kind of information was given to you to prepare you to meet him?
Okay. So he had had a formal language evaluation to rule out any type of language issues. And I actually just did an updated evaluation as well, just to confirm that, since it's been um, about a year and a half, 2 years since he had that last evaluation. Um, so he came in with no language specific concerns, but the test of childhood stuttering was administered to the student. And on that, they did notice the same types of, um, I don't know, we in therapy, we call them broken words. Um, and so they did notice those. Additionally, he did have some more of the word repetitions that were occurring much more frequently. During the course of therapy, he has eliminated a lot of those whole word repetitions and part word repetitions. They still pop in every once in a while, but they're very infrequent now compared to what they used to be.
Okay, that's really helpful. Do you know how old he was when he was diagnosed with stuttering or a speech fluency problem?
I believe it was in fifth grade.
In fifth grade. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. And in talking with him, any ideas about whether it was there before then or whether it onset, or talking to his parents? I don't know if that's part of the picture, whether the onset was around that fifth grade age.
I believe that there was a history of speech speech issues, it wasn't very clear in the paperwork what those completely entailed, though.
Okay, okay. And when you evaluated him, whether listening to his speech for disfluencies or doing the language testing, was there any change in the way that he stuttered or his disfluencies across different kinds of contexts or tasks?
Definitely, definitely. He has a lot of variability of when it's occurring. So at the conversational level, not so frequent. But if I give him some constrained tasks, such as reading, it's very prevalent in the reading. Or if I give him a task such as give me a sentence and you have to use these sets of words, then I see it occur very frequently in that context as well. If he has more range of what he can generate, it's hardly noticeable, but very prevalent in those other tasks. Now, he is responsive to the technique. We were using pausing and phrasing as a technique to kind of give him some, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it, a way to address at the reading level, and it was very effective at eliminating or reducing the amount of those breaks, but he needs reminders.
Okay, okay, that's really helpful information. So, do you get the sense, as is true for many people who stutter, that the reason it might be better in conversation is that he can choose his words and very carefully work around it, avoid ones that are more difficult, or say things in a different way to make sure that on the surface it's coming across as very smooth or fluent, where when he's reading or doing something, as you said, that required him to choose or say particular words, then he can't avoid those words or those sounds and needs to say them. And that's when you're hearing these breaks in his fluency.
Definitely. And that is one of the things that he did report is that he will sometimes change a word if he thinks it's going to be easier to say it a different way.
Okay. And does he have any other diagnoses or any other challenges in terms of schoolwork or any real strong aspects of his academic and other skills?
So he does have a diagnosis of ADHD as well.
Okay.
So
All righty. And is he on medication for ADHD?
the parents have not shared,
Okay.
so I'm not sure.
Have you had a conversation with him asking him about what he thinks is going on and when it happens and when it's harder, when it's easier? Or has he given you any information about his own perception of his speech fluency?
He doesn't have a great awareness or a great self-awareness of what his speech really sounds like. We've tried doing activities where we record and let him listen back to try and raise that awareness that it's occurring so that he can start to self-monitor for it. And if nothing else, to recognize when it's happened so that he can put a strategy, or I say strategy, but maybe start using some phrasing to help reduce the occurrence.
Okay, okay. Do you know what he's been told or what advice or what corrections he gets in daily life or even in previous therapy?
In terms of like the support for the stuttering,
Hmm.
well, he's been with me through the pandemic. um, so therapy has been a little, most definitely different than our traditional model. Um, and that for him, we have tried different traditional stuttering therapy techniques, but really the only one that really seemed to work for him was doing where he would physically go in, mark up pages to know exactly where he needed to pause, um, and then answering short response questions so that he could just give shorter answers to help him control the rate. So
Okay, yeah, that's really informative. Um, have you done anything with him to look at his attitudes about communication or the impact from his perspective of the disfluencies on his life and daily communication?
So when I asked him about that, he feels pretty good about himself as a communicator. But he on the other hand, then he'll go on to say, but I do change words.
Right.
And sometimes I won't raise my hand in class because I'm not sure it's going to come out correctly.
Okay.
But when I just ask, what do you think about your speech? Do you have any concerns? Anything that you would want people to know? He's like pretty laid back. So I think he's not really sure what he ultimately thinks about his own speech.
Right, right. And maybe it's the difference between the more global, what I think, and the more specifics, which he seems to be able to identify with your help, that sometimes he avoids raising his hand or sometimes he switches out a word. And that gives a nice clue that maybe that's the place to kind of focus. What are those things that he's doing or not doing? And then what are the pros and cons of that potentially? Or what are some alternatives to that? So the kinds of disfluencies that you're describing that he produces more often could be called, as you said, broken words. Sometimes they're called a more atypical disfluency or atypical kind of stutter. For some people, they happen because they are able to get it started. So they sort of have the hiccup in the middle. Okay. But then the repetition of the syllable isn't forward moving and isn't your, I don't know if it's traditional or not, broken word that's really a block or an inaudible sound prolongation that just happens a little bit later because he's also repeating the end of that. So it is a more atypical disfluency. Sometimes those do occur in kids who stutter. Sometimes they occur in those who clutter. So let me ask you a couple questions to get at that kind of differential diagnosis of stuttering versus cluttering or some of both. So,
Okay.
to your ear and to the ear of any other listeners who have commented, does his rate seem to be fast or slow or pretty appropriate, or does it change? And do you notice fluctuations and when those might happen?
No, I would actually say it's pretty typical. Um, so I haven't had any concerns with it. One, either too fast or too slow.
Okay. And related to that, and I think I already know the answer to this, but I'll put it out there anyway. How about his intelligibility when he's conversing with you, especially when he's talking about something that really appeals to him, telling a story, or telling about a favorite game or something like that?
No, he has good intelligibility when he's sharing interests.
Okay. And when he's sharing interests, you're seeing a pretty typical rate. You're not having trouble
Mhm.
understanding him. You're not seeing short rushes of speech
No,
or unusual pauses other than the ones that you're describing. Okay.
right.
So you hear other kinds of stutter-like disfluencies, but what you hear most is that kind of getting the word started and then repeating the first part, the end part, or are you seeing some of each?
I would say the majority are the end part. Occasionally, I'll hear him insert like a h sound before a word that starts with a vowel. Like on the word aliens, he'll say h aliens, and you'll hear those two distinct parts as he goes to produce that. It seems to occur primarily on vowels, words
Okay.
that start with a vowel.
Okay. And what would you say the impact of these disfluencies is on the clarity of his communication, the content, the message when you're talking with him?
I would say where it really seems to impact him the most is when he's reading. And so people have often thought that he has a reading issue when it's not actually, there are no indicators that say that it's a reading based issue. But it sounds like it because there's so many pauses and and sound insertions that it sounds like he's struggling to read the words as opposed to struggling to say the words.
Okay. And as far as you know from his academic background and his performance in reading, etc., reading is not an issue that you have a question about other than
Actually,
the fluency.
yeah. Well, we actually, as part of our recent updated evaluation, we did include additional measures just to make sure and rule that out.
Okay, a couple of things that you might want to give to him to see how he responds. One is the communication attitudes test, which is a true false test with about 32 questions on it that ask him about whether he speaks well and whether other people think he speaks well and that sort of thing. So that's one. Another one is called the overall assessment of the speaker's experience of stuttering. And there's one in particular that's for children between the ages of 7 and 12. The younger kids, 7, 8, sometimes struggle with it. Sometimes you have to read it, and sometimes they just don't get it. But he may be old enough to be able to fill that out. And obviously, if he wants your help to read any of that, he doesn't have to read it out loud. Then that might give you some indication of at least what he's noticing in terms of those disfluencies getting in the way or not getting in the way. One of the reasons I asked you about how other people have responded to it is that sometimes if children feel like, well, people have told me to do this, that, or the other thing, slow down, take your time, think about what you're saying, blah, blah, blah. And I just want to talk. So if I tell Miss Christine that I'm having difficulty, then, I'm going to have to do X, Y, or Z, and I'd rather just talk. Sounds like he's open to working on it. What would you say about
Mhm.
that?
He is. He is.
Okay. And something like reading, where you can plan ahead to a certain extent. Now, if you're just called on in class and you just read what comes up next, then you're not necessarily prepared. But there are also maybe some of the strategies that you've been working on, really pause, look at that first phrase, say it, go on, and work on making that as natural as possible, maybe at a slower rate with a little bit of time for preparation. That kind of approach makes sense when you're doing something that's very predictable, cut and dried, like reading can be. And for him, it shows up more there. And maybe even while it comes up in reading, take him back a little and have him do it at the phrase level, whether it's describing a simple picture or whether it's giving a phrase, and just have him get into maybe finding a rate that he says is just right. And you could have it 0 is so slow, it'll take me days to get it out. And 10 is so fast, nobody will understand me. What's just right? And then play with that until he says, okay, a 4 is just right, or 5 is just right, or whatever it might be for him. And then say, all right, give me a 6, give me a 3, and see
Okay.
if that's something. And he may not get that and then scrap it, of course. But that might be a way of saying, okay, what's something that feels good for you that accomplishes it and allows you to read out loud more fluently, if that's a goal that he wants to pursue. And it sounds like one that he has been willing to, so
Mhm.
would be reasonable. I think in terms of his not wanting to raise his hand sometimes or switching out words, that opens the opportunity for a conversation about that. Like, yeah, sometimes when words are hard to say, people come up with all sorts of really creative ways of communicating with other words, or they might say, I'm not going to raise my hand right now. And you could say, I'm curious, when you make that decision, I'm not going to raise my hand, what's going on? Is it the kind of question? Is it the word that you might want to say when you answer? And you can compliment like, oh, wow, you really think that through. And this is what's giving you trouble there.
Okay.
Okay. Uh, and sometimes that can lead to a conversation about accepting that sometimes as you're talking, the words you want to say, which are important to share because they're the exact words you want to say, might not come out smoothly. How do you feel about letting people hear that stuttering or that disfluency? You might ask him, what do you call it? What do you call it when that happens, when there's that hiccup in the middle of the word and you repeat it? And what do you think's going on? So just a more in-depth conversation about what he calls it or what he thinks it is and whatever. And he might go, I don't know. And you might go, sometimes it is a puzzle and I don't know for sure either. So I'd really like to know what you're noticing so that I can understand your particular, and sometimes we'll call it signature stuttering or signature disfluency, because everybody's is a little bit different. So I want to figure out your signature. Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, and that actually raises my question of, do I call it stuttering, or I'm not sure what to call it. Do I tell him it's stuttering, or not?
What does he think he comes to see you for? Do you know?
He thinks originally we called it stuttering, but the more I listened to it, the less I heard of what I expected the stuttering to sound like.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I don't know, like when I'm writing up um, when I'm assessing and I come to my conclusion, it's not, I'm not sure how to label it that gives him access to the service.
Right. So he does have a speech fluency challenge disorder, right? Because he's not
Okay.
able to read spontaneously and easily. He is sometimes avoiding communication. He is having interruptions in the ongoing forward flow of speech that are more
Okay.
atypical. So, and he is having some disfluencies that are more traditionally called stuttering like, right?
Yes.
So, if those are present, in addition to these ones that are more atypical, you could certainly call it stuttering.
Okay.
And when you describe the behaviors, it includes this less typical or atypical kind of disfluency. And they're stuttering like in that they interrupt the syllable level or whether it's a single syllable word or whether it's a multisyllabic word, but he repeats one syllable. And sometimes
Okay.
there's a pause in there, which might be a combination of a more of a block plus something else. So they're atypical, but they sound like they could very well be stuttering themselves.
Okay.
Okay.
That's
And
very helpful.
when we try to classify or when we try to say, well, what's the cutoff? What's the frequency of stuttering you need to say you're stuttering? And we have some data about that developmentally, but really it comes down to, well, some people may have a little bit more of that, and yet it doesn't interfere with them saying what they want to say, being understood by others, communicating their message, and they're not doing anything to try to work around it. If he is not communicating sometimes because he's afraid of, or even can predict that he might have those disfluencies of any kind on those words, then he is interfering with his own communication to avoid it.
Okay.
And that suggests that, well, that's getting in the way of his communication. And then you want to know more, like, so when you decide to put another word in there, when do you do that? Do you do it with your parents at home, with your siblings, if you have siblings? Do you do it with your friends? And when do you do it with your friends? Are there certain friends you don't do it with and others you do? Does anyone else know that you do that? And what have people said? And what kind of advice do people give you, whether teachers when you're reading or other speech language pathologists in the past? And I always spend a lot of time in interviews and getting that background information and saying, every student I see is different. And so we're going to spend some time just figuring out the puzzle that's your stuttering, your signature stuttering, if you will, so that we can come up with the best plan to make communication go as well as it possibly can. And that
Okay.
includes reading, but also includes just when you want to talk and share.
Okay.
Because if you're afraid to raise your hand, then you're not going to be able to share something that you want to share. And then you're not communicating. And that can affect not only you, but other people because they don't get to hear what you have to share.
Okay.
So kind of rationale for that.
Okay. That makes sense.
Okay. Okay. Other things about him or about his therapy that come to mind?
Ah, no, those were the big ones. Oh my goodness. Oh, I guess the other thing that I probably should have meant, and I guess it does help to confirm that it really is an issue with that impacts his communication, is that he does a lot of revising.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that just kind of confirms what you were just saying. He's either avoiding or sometimes revising what he was going to say to help
Yeah.
himself.
Yes, yes, and it might very well be an avoidance or coping strategy. And again, an opportunity to say, and I would say, I notice that sometimes when you're talking, you do this. When you do that, are you working around a sound or a word that you're afraid might get stuck or might be hard to say? And that's where you can borrow from whatever words he uses to describe. And then you can
Okay.
say, so you can predict when you think that's going to happen. And so you start what we call revising, working around it so that you can still communicate, even if it's not the exact same words. Well, what if we work on staying with the words you want to say? And when you're with me, that means if you stutter on that word, go ahead and do it. Stuttering is always safe here.
Okay.
And you can't change it if you won't let it show. And so we're just going to let it go. We're just going to let it rip in here. Okay.
Okay.
And you could even, sometimes kids really enjoy just producing different kinds of stutters, including their signature stutter, and making them really long and really short, really soft and really loud, and having fun with them. You can have a fall off your chair stutter, and so that it becomes something that is associated with control of it in a way, so taking agency over it as well as playing with it and knowing that not only are you a nice person who understands and gets it and is helping him, but also welcome that to be a part of his speech. And you could even say a lot of the kids that I see are trying to hide it because they don't want other people to hear that. And then just wait, and he might talk about that, or he might be okay with that. It might not even be something that's occurred to him. When children are very young, the stuttering tends to be pretty straightforward, repetitions usually, maybe some prolongations, maybe some blocks. Over time, it becomes more complex, and those more typical disfluencies like the revisions, or potentially even these atypical ones where he's kind of repeating at the end, tend to develop as a person tries to cope with it, to work around it, to avoid it, to not let it show. And what's good about that is that they're still trying hard to communicate, and that's important.
Right.
And hopefully, there aren't a lot of situations where he's choosing not to. And the OASIS will point to that, and the communication attitudes test will also point to that a little bit more and give you some ideas to explore.
Okay. Great.
Have you had any conversations with the family at all? I wonder what they've had to say about his speech.
They, to be honest, they don't notice it to the level that we do at school. And I think it's because at the conversational level, it's not nearly as prevalent as it is when he's given very specific um, types of responses to produce.
Okay. And that might be an indication that he's learned in everyday conversation to work around it. And so people aren't noticing. It
Yeah.
might also be helpful to talk with his teachers and get their input, and both in terms of what they're noticing when he reads aloud or in other activities in class or speaking to peers or raising his hand or things like that. I mean, they have so many kids that they're focusing on. He may just go with the flow and they're not noticing it, but there may be some situations where that happens more. And then also to get an idea of, are they giving him advice or corrections or things that might not be ideal.
Right.
And then you can also problem solve with him and with them about best ways to handle that. So let's say that he's got something coming up where he's going to give a presentation, then he can work with you potentially to
Mm-hmm.
work on that and loop the teacher in there, maybe even do a practice one with the teacher before giving it to the class. Now, he may be a happy go lucky presenter, yet the quality of presentations for all of us, right, can always be tweaked in ways that
Right.
help us make better eye contact, use our voice better, use our gestures, use our pausing, maybe not use the revising and saying the words that he wants to say. So lots of communication variables that can be worked on in there as
Okay.
well. So I think one of the things that might be helpful is to bridge the gap between therapy and the classroom. So one way to do that is to talk with the teachers and see what they're noticing in different classes, whether reading is something that occurs in the class and how he's doing with that, whether or not they're giving him advice while he's trying to talk or read, and maybe help them with the pros and cons of those kinds of things. And then
Okay.
also whether they notice if he's raising his hand or not, and when he might do that, and if they're noticing that he revises a lot, or if there's a lack of clarity maybe because of that, or even though he revises, he gets his message across and maybe doesn't sound that much different than any other middle schooler in the classroom situation. And that way you can partner with them as needed. And if
Okay.
he has an upcoming presentation or something like that, that might be a good place to help him to work on overall communication skills. So the nonverbals like eye contact and rate and pausing and saying the words that you intend to say, whether it's a complete oral presentation or in conjunction with PowerPoints or some other visual kind of stimuli, and engaging his audience and vocal variety and loudness, and even the parameters of giving a talk and an opening and a closing, and taking
Okay.
questions and things in between. And he could prepare something like that with you, and you could help him with those different elements, and then maybe do a practice run with the teacher if that's something that's agreeable, and that gives him two experiences with it to prepare for when he delivers it to his peer, and that can build all sorts of different kinds of skills that would be really valuable for him.
Okay.
And then potentially down the road, when you think it's appropriate, that ability to self-advocate,
Okay.
whether that's if he starts to allow that stuttering to show, then who might be the next person to talk to about that or to let that stuttering show? Let's plan that out very specifically.
Okay.
Okay. And then do it. And that's a win. I let it show. What was a win about that? I said the words I wanted to say. I ordered the food I wanted to order. I asked the question I wanted to ask. And then the other piece was potentially helping him to self advocate. So as you're working on what he's doing, and especially any avoidances, and acknowledging that those are coping, they're understandable, they're creative, and all that good stuff. And yet they get in the way of his saying what he wants to say, or even sometimes even entering into a conversation or sharing something in class. And so you could tell him that other children you work with, they really had to allow that stuttering to show before they could get rid of the tendency to revise or to put in another word or even to not to speak. And so that in your therapy room, it's always a great place to go ahead and say the word you want to say, and whether it comes out smooth or not, whether it's stuttered or not, disfluent or not, you're going to focus on that's the word, and that's a win.
Okay.
And helping him to get used to that. And then to gradually plan very specific situations, people, etc., to let that stuttering show. And it can be planned right down to the exact words that he's going to say. Sometimes clients will find it helpful to do that first in the therapy room. And so one of the things that they might do is just make cold calls where they're calling a number and the other person doesn't know them, won't know them, and they can hang up anytime they want, and they could ask questions about inventory in a store or hours or whatever that might be, and go ahead and maybe even purposefully throw in some stuttering that is their signature stuttering, but they're doing it voluntarily or on purpose. And it's
Okay.
just taking control of it. It's getting used to it, desensitizing oneself as well as others to it, and gaining some agency or power over that as well.
Okay. I love the ideas. It gives us so much that we can do in our setting. I guess my other question would be is how do we're in the school system, we're stuck writing this as an IEP goal. And how do I contain that within a goal?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And Christine, that's sort of the $1 million question that
I know.
gets asked a lot because so often what we're looking at is things like particular rubrics like frequency or severity or things like that. And those can be useful, especially if you're qualifying a child. And given the frequency of his disfluencies, their duration, etc., certainly on something like the SSI, which is useful for that, and most schools will take it, you can qualify him for stuttering. However, using the OASIS, for example, that also will give you a severity rating. The talks that was used previous to your working with him, that also has severity ratings, and it has them both for when the child is talking in terms of different kinds of speaking tasks and different levels, as well as you can have parents or teachers or even speech pathologists who have known him longer fill out the observational rating scale of the test of
Okay.
childhood stuttering. And that one-page form gives you at the top examples of the kinds of disfluencies and also when and with whom they occur. And then the bottom of it is the consequences. So embarrassment, avoidance, physical concomitants, getting rejected by other children, things like that are in the bottom. Now, with someone your client's age, while the test did not do this as part of their development, I often will give it to the child and say, you fill this out so that I can learn what you're noticing. And that's
Okay.
also another way to kind of qualify. So those are our assessment kinds of tools that can be used to say this child stutters, this child has speech fluency issue, it's getting in the way of communication, and so therefore he qualifies. Okay. But then it
Can
comes
I
in, yes.
can I ask one question about that? So when I'm doing something like the talks and I'm only hearing those atypical occurrences, am I allowed to indicate those as stutter behaviors on the talks on a standardized measure like that? Or should I just write it up, more as the narrative after? So although he didn't demonstrate typical on this, I did this atypical was observed.
Okay. So what I would say is when he is producing those atypical disfluencies, are
Mhm.
you noticing any tension or struggle?
I would probably say that the tension I hear is here in his throat.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes that can be where avoidance can also creep in so that they're kind of holding it, and that might produce that little hiccup in the middle, and then he
Mm-hmm.
repeats it to keep moving forward. So I would say that for him, that is his signature stuttering.
Okay, so I
Okay.
can, okay,
Yeah. I
that
mean,
is very, very helpful.
it's not your garden variety stuttering, but it's a hybrid.
Right.
So, um, traditionally, repetitions, prolongations, blocks, broken words may be in the middle. And some people even debate whether certain kinds of repetitions even fit in there, right? So we can back away from that and say, okay, is he disfluent? When he produces those disfluencies, are they getting in the way? And does it look like he's struggling to move forward, to keep speech going in that, and it interferes, to go back a little bit to the technical, with that sound or syllable? And you would say that is true for him. So
Okay.
what I sometimes do is, if I'm using like a traditional count sheet, which has those traditional, typical, and stutter-like disfluencies, I will add another category that, especially if something occurs a whole lot and that's their signature disfluency stutter, and
Okay.
that will be another category that I will add to my delineation of types. And then usually it's the primary one that
Mm-hmm.
happens within there. So give it a name, label it, say that's his stuttering, that's his disfluency pattern.
Okay.
Yeah, and struggle and tension, when those are present, when the child seems to be breaking the flow and unable to move forward, and you're hearing that, then I would say that's stuttering like.
Okay. Great. I feel much better now going through and completing that analysis now that I know how I can um, mark those and discuss those. So,
Okay. Yeah, and that's a great question, because I would imagine that's one of those that comes up a lot. This isn't traditional. And so what do
right.
I do with that? And when I'm teaching students how to take counts, especially when we're taking samples from adults who might be doing a lot of different avoiding, or who might have very complex moments of stuttering, and they're like, I don't know what to call that. And it could be a combination of things. And then I'll say, just listen for a while, get used to the pattern, get it in your head, get it in your mouth, start to think this is for them, the way that they stutter, and then
Okay.
explore the why and the where and all of that below that, kind of how it got there. And those tricks or avoidances tend to get layered on over time. And sometimes they'll say, oh, well, I used to do that and it helped and it stopped working, but I still do it. And then I added this and then I added this. And that can often happen over time as well.
Okay.
So you want to portray, this is what he does, this is what's getting in the way, this is his signature or primary type, and it's a
Okay.
combination, or it sounds like this, and put a little example of that, and this is how often it occurs.
Okay. Great.
I'm glad
Thank
you
you.
asked that.
That's very, very helpful.
And then in terms of goals, um, a lot of times they're written focused on things like frequency or severity, right? Not always very helpful. For
Right.
example, if I could have 1% frequency, okay, and if my 1% is like that, you are not going to say I stutter. If my 1% is like, you're going to say you stutter. I don't care if it happens once in 100 words. That's stuttering. Okay. So it's
Okay.
quality as well as quantity, tension and struggle, and features like that that you're looking for. So focusing on frequency or severity, you can have those along the way, especially as sort of long term objectives where you want to compare over time. But what you want to focus on is the goals that help him to get toward better communication. So reducing the revisions and saying the word he wants to say, could even be allowing that stuttering to show and doing that more frequently in conversation. It could be a goal for raising his hand when he has an answer he wants to share. It could be, and the way that you can go about goals like that is to scale them. So, for
Okay.
example, if he tells you and you say, I wonder how often, and you might have to break it down by different classes or teachers or subjects, things like that. Um, I wonder how often you raise your hand when you have something to share in your favorite class? Is it, if 0 is you never raise your hand, and 10 is every time you think of something you want to share, that hand goes up. Okay. What are you doing? Where are you now?
Okay.
And have them give that a number. And then you can ask, okay, so on that same scale, 0, you never raise your hand and answer a question. 10, you have that hand up all the time. Where would you like to be to say that's a good balance? I'm jumping in there, I'm contributing, but I'm not dominating and I'm not remaining silent. And then you have a goal to say on a scale from 0 to 10 and give the anchors from the current whatever number, show progression to the goal number by
Okay.
raising his hand more frequently as self-reported. Or you could say, and is reported by the teacher, because we're going to loop the teacher in here and say, this is his goal. And preferably, whether you go with him or not, he's going to be the one to say, hey, I set this goal in therapy. Can you keep me honest? Can you keep an eye on it? You don't need to say anything, but this is what I'm
Okay.
working on, because that can make a good eye contact and a big smile from the teacher who knows, you just hit that goal and you can go tell
Mm-hmm.
Miss Christine about that. So you can scale a lot of different behaviors.
Okay.
When you give him the oasis, you will be able to see what are some situations that he's talking less in than he wants to. What are some You can also have him give you lists of tricks or avoidances in what he's doing, and then ask him how much of the time do you do that and in what situations, and set goals. And the goals can be in class, with my friends at the lunch table, with my family at home. So I would set lots of goals that are based on scaling. And you want to think
Okay.
about, do you need goals that are about the behavior? So hiding the stuttering versus showing the stuttering, for example, or raising your hand versus not raising your hand. Does he want goals that are about the cognitive? So whenever this teacher calls on me, I think if I answer that question, I need to say that word and I'm going to stutter. And what? I'll feel bad. They'll laugh at me, whatever that might be. And you can talk about that. Children, adults as well, are often very all or nothing about that kind of thinking. Either I'm going to say it fluently or I'm not. I'm going to be embarrassed or I'm not. They're going to laugh at me or they're not, rather than let's make a prediction. How often do you think that happens? And then let's go do an experiment. Let's set up for the next week. Where do you want to try it out and see if that actually happens?
Okay.
And then that sort of starts to get just one example of that at the thoughts about it. Lisa Scott did a wonderful DVD that's now a streaming video available from the Stuttering Foundation on cognitive behavioral therapy for children who stutter. And she gives some really wonderful examples, and there's some tools to use there too that are really helpful for getting at thoughts and really aimed at probably very nicely in this middle school kind of a range for you. So that's one tool. And there are other streaming videos as well that get into cognitive behavioral therapy, and also goal setting. Look for solution focused brief
Okay.
therapy. There's a recent one that was done by another therapist at the Michael Palin Center in London, talking about solution focused brief therapy, but I think it was given a different name, with families and with children, that's
Okay.
quite good as well. So those might be some fun resources to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. And did I see that the Stuttering Foundation is included in their summer, the Boston workshop? That stuttering
Yes, and I'm glad you
solution
brought that
focused.
up. Yeah,
I've attended
so
one of the. I attended the Philadelphia one. It was
oh
amazing, like
oh wonderful. I'm so
amazing.
glad you did. Okay,
Yes.
so yes, so that's coming up in Boston in person this year. So there will be Palin parent-child interaction therapy, solution-focused brief therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy, all covered by Elaine and Allie are coming from the Michael Palin Center for that. So yeah, that'd be another
I'll have
great
to get
one
my
to go to.
application in. Oh gosh, I don't think I have any additional questions, although I'm sure when I jump off here, I'll be like, ah, I'll think of 25 more questions. But no, I think we hit on everything. I feel much more confident in kind of analyzing what I have now and what I still need to get to help me have a complete picture or a much more complete picture than what I currently have.